Chapter 14. The two scientists worked in a tense silence throughout the day. The next morning, he noticed there was no coffee prepared for him, although he didn't mention it. Instead, he went to where she was already hard at work, examining the effects of plasma on the cultures. The results were not as immediate as they had been with the mouse blood, but the bugs appeared to be eradicated. The filaments were destroyed, and the large cells were nowhere to be found. It appeared to be a cure, at least in the culture bottles. "We'll require test subjects," he concluded. "In my world, there must be animals, but alas, we have none. Thankfully, this substance is not poisonous. We require a natural immune system and a carrier of the infection. 2 of each, so that one can be treated and the other can be used as a control. That makes 4. It is not enough to be certain, but it will have to suffice." 2, Stan corrected me. "You are not infected, I am." 2 others, I agreed. "I will obtain them from Jake." Most of GHQ was outside, but I found Jake in the large schoolroom where he enjoyed his morning meal. I explained the situation to him, and he agreed immediately, turning to the others in the room. "Who has experienced the jumping headache?" "Okay, Swanee. Who has never had it?" He was taken aback when 3 men out of the 8 present nodded. "I suppose you will go, Tom." The 2 men stood up, extinguishing their cigarettes, and left with me. Stan had everything arranged. They flipped a coin to determine who would be treated. I noticed that Stan would not receive any plasma, while I was scheduled for everything. I watched as she prepared the culture and added the accelerator that would hasten the development and ensure that Tom and I were infected. Then she injected it. That was all, except for the waiting. To maintain similar conditions, we were to remain there until the tests were complete, not even eating for fear of disrupting the conditions. Swanee produced a pack of worn cards and began to deal while I retrieved some large pills to use as chips. An hour later, the agony began. I had just won the pot of 50 pills and was about to gloat when an explosion seemed to detonate inside my head. Even closing my mouth was excruciating. A moment later, Tom began to perspire. The pain grew worse, spreading throughout the back of the head and neck. I lay on the cot, envious of Stan and Swanee, who had already been infected naturally. I desperately craved Bracky and had to remind myself repeatedly that no drugs could disrupt the tests. It was the longest day of my life, and I began to doubt whether I could endure it. I watched the small clock tick from 1 minute to 9, then to half a minute, holding my breath until it reached 9. There was no doubt that the infection had taken hold. Now we could numb the pain. Stan had already dissolved the anodyne tablets in water, and Swanee was distributing 3 lit Bracky cigarettes. It took a few minutes for the anodyne to take effect, and even then it could not alleviate all of the pain. But compared to what we had experienced, it did not matter. I inhaled the cigarette, extinguished it, and began to deal the cards again. We had an ample supply of the anodyne and used it generously throughout the night. The test was a sped-up simulation of the natural progression of the disease, where most people here would have to wait for painkillers, but then they would be used liberally. Precisely at 9 in the morning, Stan began to inject Swanee and me with plasma. Now, there was no thought of cards. The group waited anxiously, their attention divided between the clock and their conversation. Doc had predicted that an hour would be sufficient to yield results, but it was difficult to keep in mind that this was just a rough estimate. He winced as Stan took a small sample of flesh from his neck. She then proceeded to do the same for the other members of the group before preparing the slides. "Miley." She read the name of the slide as she placed it under the microscope. Suddenly she gasped, "Only dead cells." The same thing was true for Swanee and Tom. Each had to examine their own slide and have it explained to them before they could believe the results. Finally, Stan examined her own slide and nodded. "It's what it should be. It checks." Tom whooped and ran out the door to inform Jake. They only had enough plasma for about 200 injections, but that should be sufficient proof. Once they offered salvation, it should be easy to convince people to donate blood from their children. When they finally used up the last of the plasma, they could finally relax. Stan removed her smock and collapsed onto the cot, exhausted. "You're forgiven, Dan," she said with a tired smile before falling asleep. Doc intended to join her, but it felt like too much effort. He rested his head on his arms and wondered why Stan had called off their feud. When he woke up, it was night time, and he was lying on the cot. He felt someone shaking him and looked up to see Jake. Stan was making coffee. "We took Southport," Jake announced, slumping onto the cot beside Doc. "What?" Doc exclaimed. "We took it, lock, stock, and barrel. I thought your cure would give the men some courage, and it did. But we probably would have taken it anyway. There was nothing left to fight for after Earth pulled out and the plague hit. Wilson mistook last-minute panic for fighting spirit. The poor devils didn't have anything to fight about once the lobby stopped egging them on." Doc tried to process the news, but it didn't seem to matter much. Maybe his revolutionary fervor had cooled once the lobby men had left. "We'll need more plasma than there is in Southport," he said. "Not necessarily," Jake disagreed. "Doc, 3 of the men you injected were shot down as runners. Your plasma is no good." "It takes time to work, Jake. I told you there might be a case or 2 that would be too close to the edge. 3 is more than I expected, but it's not impossible." "We had plenty of time. They blew up after we got back from Southport," Jake explained. Jake placed his hand on Doc's shoulder, his expression softening. "Harkness tested every man you injected. He finished half an hour ago. 5 showed dead bugs. The others weren't helped at all." Doc struggled to find a weed, but his thoughts were scattered. 5! He exclaimed. 5 out of 200. That's about average. And what about Tom? He was ecstatic after the test last night, claiming you cured him and that he saw dead bugs, but he never had the jumping headache, and you never gave him the plasma. Yet he has dead bugs. Harkness confirmed it, Jake said. Doc slowly realized his own foolishness. Tom had never been treated, yet Stan reported dead bugs. They were all so desperate for a cure that they couldn't think straight. "There was a bump on his neck, a small one," Doc said. "Jake, he must have caught it, even if he seemed immune. If he was taking anodyne anyway for something or unconscious." "He had a kidney operation in Northport 6 years ago," Jake admitted. "We had to chip in to pay for it, but you still didn't treat him and he's cured. Face it, Doc, that plasma is no good inside the body." Jake squeezed Doc's shoulder. "We're not blaming you. We don't judge a man here except by what he is. Maybe the stuff helps a little. We'll keep using it when we get it. Tell everybody you were a bit optimistic, so they'll think it's a gamble, but have a little hope left. And you keep trying. Something cured it in Tom. Now you find out what." Doc watched Jake leave, feeling numb. He turned to Stan. "It can't be right," she said shakily. "You and Swanee were cured. Maybe it was the accelerator. It had to be something." "You didn't have the accelerator," he pointed out. "No, and I still have live bugs. I was never supposed to be cured, so I expected to see just what I saw. How I missed the fact that Tom should have been like me, I don't know. Damn it, oh damn it," she cried, something he had never seen her do except in anger. But she quickly composed herself. "All right. Plasma works in a bottle but not in an adult body. Maybe something works in the body but not in a bottle. Maybe. And maybe some people are just naturally immune after it reaches a certain stage. Maybe we ran into coincidence," he said. But he didn't believe that, and neither did she. The answer had to be in the room. He had taken a massive dose of the disease and been cured in a few hours. Outside the room, the war raged on, but inside the battle was less successful. It wasn't the accelerator or the anodyne tablets. They even tried sweeping the floor and using the dust, but with no results. In the lab, Jake selected 4 volunteers for another test. They were injected with plain salt water instead of plasma and were completely cured of the plague. However, the disease continued to spread, with about 4 out of every 100 people becoming infected and curing themselves. Northport fell to the rebels, putting the entire planet in their hands. Jake returned, exhausted and defeated. He was one of the natural immunes, but the weight of the campaign against the plague left him with no reason to celebrate. Jake revealed a message from the space and medical lobbies, stating that they would blow up the planet unless they received the cure and the rebels surrendered. They had 2 days to comply. The rockets were visible with binoculars, and there were enough to destroy all life on the planet. Stan, who had risked herself in the hands of the enemy, worked tirelessly, but the lobbies had forgotten her. Dan suggested that he could agree to share his ideas, specimens, and notes with the lobbies. but Stan was unsure if they would settle for that. Dan knew he was lying to himself when he said they could find a miracle in 2 days. There was nothing left to try.